Okay, we're recording.
Got that fancy wedding dress and walking the church and the say, how you doing, John? Why are you on the dress?
You just, okay.
If you could take your seats.
Yeah. And then I'll turn it over to you to walk people through. So I'm going to be what we described. And then I'll let you introduce the 5 steps and exactly right. Yeah. No. And then let them ask the questions. Now and a half, right? Okay, folks, let's regather. And thank you, those of you on video, for being patient. 5 minutes late is not bad, actually. 9 minutes late is not that bad. 10 would really suck. So the weather's, getting back from lunch in the weather has been really hard. So what we want to do is walk you through the steps of the process that we have designed, which we call the 5-step process, which has 2 parts, one for clergy and one for congregations. And part of the reason for us distinguishing between clergy part of the process, congregation part of the process, which Fiona will walk you through in a few minutes, is that we as clergy are ourselves needing to be in places and safe places where we can be learners ourselves in how do you actually lead congregations through culture change. How do you lead congregations into places of taking on a different focus and learning to begin to ask new kinds of questions. And so part of what we do is create those safe spaces where you as clergy can go about that learning process while you are engaged with the congregation as it goes through the process. The second reason we do it this way was picked up earlier this morning in our text dwelling where one of you asked, I think it was, I can't remember your name, Gary asked, so how come they were sent out by twos and we're sent out like ones? Because here's one thing that we know is that the more you get sent out like ones, the more you do fall amongst the wolves. And so part of what we want to invite you to, if you entered this process, is how do you discover in a process of experimenting and a process of action learning. So this is not conversation. This is acting and reflecting and acting. to actually become teams of clergy with and for one another, rather than solo pastors in particular locations. Because we are pretty convinced that unless you are Jesus, none of us will figure out how to lead congregations into adaptive culture change in our context by ourselves. I am pretty sure, as a clergy person, as an educator, as someone who coaches all kinds of clergy and all kinds of execs, we can't do it by ourselves. It is the kiss of death. And so part of what we want to do over an 18-month period is give you both a taste and an experience and an understanding of how to work together at engaging the challenges that you're facing in the congregations where you find yourselves. We've got to overcome the solo pastoral model. It just doesn't have a future. And we've got to create clusters of clergy in areas who are working with each other. So, those are some pieces. Now, this morning, we very deliberately walked you through some exercises which are key to the process. Some of those exercises were beginning where you are, listening and engaging, hearing your questions, starting where you are. And so one of the key things that we know is that culture change or transformation is about starting where people are, where you are, where your congregations are, not where we want them to be. Secondly, we spent time in Scripture with the dwelling process, the lectio, in order to say culture change is profoundly about how we learn new habits and practices. And one of the important new habits and practices, particularly in congregations, is to believe again that amongst the people of God themselves are all the capacities to hear what God is up to. And I know, because I've been with you before, that that is a deep Lutheran commitment and conviction, but it's not a practice. That you, like most denominations in North America, have formed a clergy guild that has fundamentally removed the Scripture from the ordinary people of God. And that's not to say our work as being those who live in Scripture and preach it is unimportant. It's to say that inadvertently it had consequences we didn't plan on, which is most people in our congregations actually don't believe that they, as ordinary men and women, can dwell before Scripture and hear what God is up to. And so one of the disciplines, one of the spiritual disciplines, is how we begin to give Scripture back to our people, not as knowledge and information, but as discernment and listening and hearing the Spirit. Another spiritual discipline, I'm just responding to questions that were asked here, is, let me put it in this way, because this is a big part of the journey. I was trained, I don't mean this as a power move at all, just to explain. I was trained, almost finished a PhD in this, in what was called linguistic philosophy, analytic linguistic philosophy, in which you are trained to pay attention to the way words are used and the way they're put together and how people are using words. And when I listen, most of the time, to the way the word spiritual is used, most of the time it's about what I, as a private individual, do by myself in the inner recesses of myself. That's how I hear the word spiritual being used. I'm not questioning whether it was intended to be used that way. In other words, spiritual is that which has nothing to do with the real world. Spiritual has nothing to do with the physical and the material and the everyday. And so what we tend to do is talk about spiritual practices, which says to most of our people, this is religious stuff. It doesn't have a lot to do with my everyday life. Now, when I put it that way, you all know that Luther would rise from the dead and kick you through the goalposts of life with that kind of understanding of spiritual, because Luther was a profoundly material human being, right? It was in the utter ordinariness of everyday life that Luther believed God was up to stuff. So part of what we want to do in this process is, and let me use the word and then redefine it. We want to introduce some new spiritual practices. Now that I've used the word, I want to propose that we don't use the word, because I don't think it's helpful anymore. We want to introduce some new practices of Christian life, which are these. What would it look like if you and I as clergy and the people of our congregation parish began walking around their neighborhood, and their prayer practice became things like, Lord, show to me what's going on amongst my neighbors. Lord, how do I see you in my neighbor? That becomes a prayer. So I do this, alongside of saying the Lord's Prayer every day, in my neighborhood I begin to say, Lord, open my eyes to who you are and what you're doing in this community. That's a practice. Or another practice is, Lord, how do I learn to sit at the table of the other in my neighborhood and listen to the stories of who they are and how they're formed and what they're doing? These are practices, but they notice where the energy and the focus of these practices move. And what I've learned, and many others, not just me, what I've learned is this. The more I attend and sit with the other, the more the God questions become alive, and the more I discern what God is doing. So those are some of the directions that we want to move in. On page 4, we have briefly began to summarize some of the things that we've learned along the way. And like you, most of the things that we've learned along the way are the results of trying and failing. Practically everything we've learned is by having to reflect upon the fact that what we did didn't work. Right? Experimenting. And experimenting is a huge part of the 5-step process we want to invite you into, because it's about learning new habits and practices. So, first thing, and I heard this mentioned this morning, and it was good news to my ears. This synod is saying we want to own, and we want to be critically important and a part of a process of engaging you as clergy and your congregations. And you might call it transformation, you might call it renewal, you might call it missional change. The labels don't matter. Here's what we've learned. Instead of picking on Christian Reform, let me now pick on Episcopalians. Episcopalians, those are American Anglicans. Episcopalians have come late to the missional conversation. But they are like French Canadians. They come late to the train, but once they get on the train, they go way past the stop. That's how a French Canadian described it with me in terms of culture change. They said, how do you explain, with the Cultural Revolution, how do you explain that you folk were dripping in Catholic culture, and in less than in less than a generation, in the blink of an eye, there's hardly any priest in any seminary and hardly anybody studying for the novitiate. What happened? And he smiled and he said, easy. He says, we're always the last to get on the train, but once we get on it, we go way past the stop. You overdo it. So, that was the joke you didn't get. And I'm quoting, okay? So here's what the Episcopalians are doing. Bishops go to conferences. And these days, the conferences they go to are conferences led by a guy who teaches theology at Luther Seminary. His name is Dwight Shiley. And Dwight's written a book on the people of God. And Dwight is actually an Episcopalian. And these Lutheran bishops, they all go to these events, and they now are hearing the missional language through Dwight, and they're going back to the diocese and saying, missional is what it's about. And because they're bishops, here's what they do. They say to some poor sucker in the diocese, we're going to hire you part-time, and we're going to pay you, now go run the missional stuff. And then the bishops go off and do all their normal, usual management, polity, procedures, or they go off on boondoggles to South America or somewhere else to do bishop stuff, and which is probably important. And then these poor people, it's not Larry, I'm not talking about Larry. And so these poor people in the dioceses who are now paid some money to do this, you know what they do? They buy books and they give them out to everybody. And they then on with those books, they have pastors' meetings. So they bring clergy together for a half day, and always in the afternoon so you can have wine before you go home. And they...
We're laughing because guess where Ed and I were yesterday?
Oh, gosh.
At an Anglican meeting, talking about mission stuff.
And they have book discussions. And as if book discussions will change clergy. I mean, some of you heard me say, the thing clergy love are discussion groups. Because when you get ordained, you're given a secret card. And the secret card says, you all know, don't you, now, that when you have a discussion group, one of the rules of the discussion groups is make sure you don't decide to do anything. And so they have all these discussion groups and all these meetings, and because they've read it, they now know how to do missional. Well, the key thing is, here's what we found. In those systems, but whether presbyteries or synods or dioceses or regions, where the key leadership, a bishop, a presbytery exec, a regional exec, take ownership and are involved and are invested, and they don't just pass it off to somebody else, real change and transition takes place. Where that is not present, it does not take place. So that's one of the things we've learned. Second thing that we've learned, I could say more about Anglicans, but I'm an Anglican, by the way. I'm a confirmed Anglican. I'm blessed. Okay. The second thing to say that what we've learned is that culture change requires us to learn from one another. I've said that to you clearly, and this is why we're going to be clustering congregations. Because congregations and teams in congregations are going to learn from one another. And they're going to learn that in different ways, they know how to problem solve when they get into places where they don't know where to go. And so what they're going to learn through this process is that they don't need to depend upon experts. They can actually learn from one another in teams. I'm going to show them how to do that. And what we're going to do in this process is build into, particularly working with Juliana, build into the synod process processes of engaging congregations in their own learning. So again, what we've learned is that you've got to bring congregations together and clergy together to become co-learning communities, because then you build something into the DNA that continues after you've left. Does that make sense? Because, third thing we've learned is that clergy are very good at initiating, but that what clergy initiates only lasts as long as they're around to keep the initiating going. And so we've learned that clergy have got to behave in a different way, got to have different skills and practices, and you've got to give congregation some of that responsibility. Okay? The next thing that we've learned is that if you build a change process or a transformation process on the early adopters, you will not get change or transformation. Okay? Early adopters do not change the culture of a community of people. This does not mean that early adopters are unimportant. But one of the big mistakes that clergy make is that they tend to bet the house on the early adopters. You with me? Again, I don't want to repeat things I've done with some of you already, but I fell into the trap. First church I was there, 6 to 8 months in, some people gather around me and they begin to tell me that they've been praying for me. I'm the one. And that they've been waiting for a pastor to come who could lead them in the new ways. And these were the early adopters. And I had to learn the hard way that if you invest your time and energy in the early adopters, you will never get the place where the real culture change takes place. Here's why. You don't change the culture of a congregation or even a system of congregations until you begin to engage what we call the broad middle. You know what we mean by the broad middle? Okay, I can draw that for you. This is standard stuff. You've all seen it. That in any group, in any community of people, a congregation or any organization in this room, you've got 80% of people who are the broad middle. You've got maybe 5 to 6% who are the early adopters, and you've got, don't add these numbers up, you've got 5 or 6% who are what we call the resistors, right? Any group will break out that way. Now, if you're sophisticated, people break this group down into all kinds, but that doesn't matter. But here's the point. Early adopters are what we call ideational people. They have been to the mountaintop and they have seen the promised land. Okay? That is the dangerous thing about early adopters. Okay? That's why planting churches with early adopters is a recipe for disaster. Because there's what?
They're the zealots.
They're the zealots. So they see where things need to go. And they want to get on board, and they've done all that. They've read all the books and they're ready to go. Because they're ideational people. Okay? Now, a lot of us in this room are ideational people. I'm an ideational person. I see it and I want to get there. I had to learn that most of the broad middle are what you call concrete sequentials. You see, clergy would come up to me and say, I've read all your stuff, but how do you do it? And inside, a little voice that I never let out would, how could you be so stupid? It's obvious. Right? That's the ideational intuitive. But you see, most folk, if you can't show it to me, one step at a time, I have no idea what you're talking about. Or, I'll understand what you're talking about when I see somebody else doing it. Or, what are the steps? That is your concrete sequential. And unless you engage your concrete sequential, you won't get culture change. Right? The second thing about the broad middle, this is the good news about the broad middle, is that they actually don't go to church to change the world. Let that one sink in a little bit. 80% of the people in your congregation, and if your congregation is in crisis, it'll be more than that, aren't there because they want to change anything. That's not why they're there because, well, my wife goes, so I'll go, or I was born a Lutheran, I don't like this pastor, but damn it, I'll outlast him or her. I had a crisis in my life a number of years ago, and Mary Jones from such and such Lutheran church was there for me, and it really made a difference, and I began going to the church, and I just love it, and I love the family sense there, and the relationships there. Those are the stories you get. But they are not there to change the world. And so, unless these folk start to engage in transformation, you get no culture change. Now, all of this begins to explain why a pastor comes in, does the dog and pony show for 8 years. Some get excited, and when he or she moves on to the next one to repeat the dog and pony show, things go back to the way they were before, because you don't get this. So culture change is about engaging the broad middle. And therefore, the 5-step process we want to guide you through this afternoon very briefly is about how you get at the broad middle. The next thing that we learned, I said this before lunch, is you don't change the culture of a congregation by trying to change the culture of a congregation. You don't make that the front focus. It's inadvertent. It is not straight on. You're doing other things. In fact, we are pretty clear, more or less, that if you want to change the culture of a congregation in the way we're describing it, you make it very clear to the congregation that through this process, nothing is going to change. Now, what we mean by nothing is going to change is that there's no new programs you can introduce. There's no organizational changes. There's no structural changes. We're not going to redefine leadership. You're not going to do any of those things. Because all of those things don't change culture. Okay? You change structure, you change program, you change organization, you change roles. When a sufficient number of people in a congregation say, we're behaving differently, now let's align what we're doing with the way we're behaving. We tend to do it the other way around. Right? So these are the things that have gone into what we're doing. Next one, I've said enough about this, I won't repeat it, but when owned and initiated by clergy, change processes will have life as long as those clergy are around. So we are walking you through a process in which all of the work that the congregation will be involved in will be directed by a team inside the congregation. And the clergy cannot be on that team. But the clergy have to find a way of relating to that team so that the congregation is learning its own place and its own power. The next thing that we're learning, and this is a very important one, is that it's easy to begin a process. It's difficult to sustain a process. And that here is I'm not stealing your time yet, am I? Okay. Here's what we've learned. If you draw a matrix, and in this part of the matrix, I have all this on PowerPoint, we don't need it. In this part of the matrix, a group of clergy and some congregation members come together. Maybe it's a retreat, maybe it's this kind of thing. And they all agree, we need to change, we need to be different. They use language like we need transformation, we need renewal, we need to become missional. They all agree with that. And probably every one of them, like you folk here, could stand up and give all kinds of very good reasons why we need to change, we need to renew. And you could probably quote missional this, missional that, missional everything else. So being convinced of the need to change is not the hard work. I no longer have to convince people. 5 years ago I did. So if you start there and you go, we're all there. Knowing you need to change and being convinced you need to change doesn't produce change. Because, and this is a study that was done a number of years ago, in about 80% of the cases where organizations, whether business organizations, not-for-profit organizations, or religious organizations, meet together, plan together, and convince and say to each other we need to change, they fail to change. And the reason that they fail to change, it's going to be, it's called fail to change. The reason they fail to change is what we call defaults or habits. Is that inside of us as congregations and clergy are ways of doing things that we've learned over a long period of time. They're habits, they're practices, they're attitudes, they're values, and they're just inside of us. In other words, we already have a culture about who we are. And that culture is like glasses. You don't see it, but it defines you. You know, the classic illustration that we used to use was, what's the hardest thing to teach a fish?
How to swim.
Is what?
How to swim.
No, that's easy.
What water is?
Water. The hardest thing to teach a fish is what water is. Why? It's their environment. The hardest thing for any group of people to see is their own culture, their own habits, their own practices, their own attitudes and values. Does this make sense? Right? And so, the reason culture change fails is because people don't learn and practice new habits. We are going to give you, as clergy and as congregations, some simple, new/old habits and practices to begin doing. Here's why. No social group changes its culture by thinking about it. No social group thinks its way into a new reality. That is the modern myth. We act our way into new habits and practices. We practice our way into a new way of being church. So, reading books, having study sessions, bringing gurus in, doesn't change a thing until we start trying out new habits and practices. And that's what we're going to do in terms of clergy and congregations. But there's a third piece. So if this is about habits and practice, the third piece is about time. You'll notice in a congregation that about 18 to 20 months into a congregation's engagement in a new thing, it gets tired. And it says, this is not working, what's next? Familiar with this? Right? Just go down the list of the stuff that you've done, right? And you'll notice that there's that kind of rhythm. The problem is, new practices, learning new practices together takes time. It's going to take about 5 years for a group of people called a congregation to learn new practices sufficiently that they're inside them and they're the way they work. But we don't have 5 years because no congregation will sign up for something 5 years long. So what we do is say, let's covenant for 18 months, something like that. And at the end of 18 months, let's stop and let's assess what we've done and what we've learned and decide what the next steps will be. So culture change won't happen in 18 months, but it'll start getting you down the road. And congregations can only sustain about that amount of work before they have to stop and redecide and re-up. So what we've done is design a process which gives congregations what we call early wins. Doesn't change the world, but at the end of 18 months they can say, here's what we've done, here's what worked, here's what didn't work, here's what we've experienced, now let's do some more. That's basically what we're up to. And this is what we've just learned. I don't think I need to... Yeah. The final thing there, which is the last one on here, is we are, to massively oversimplify this, and you all learned this in seminary, what we're introducing is an action learning cycle. And so, it's as simple as this. You begin with action. You reflect upon that action. If I can spell. Anyway, you know what I mean. And out of that reflection, you create new actions, which leads to more. It's that iterative cycle. And we're seeking to say, this is the core learning practice that you build into the DNA of your life as congregations and clergy. And it's not about program. We're going to run this program and then see what's next. And it's about experimenting so that what you put into the DNA of a system is this. No matter what the challenge is that's ahead of us, and we don't know, we do not know what the challenges are ahead of us. No matter what they are, guess what? In this synod, we have learned through action learning and experimenting that when we come together with good process, there's nothing that we can't address in the name of Jesus and begin to deal with it. And that's way different than what's the next program. That's why we talk about a process, not a program. Yesterday, we were on the phone to Colin Johnson, who's the Metropolitan Bishop of the Diocese of Toronto that we've been working with for the last 2 years. Gone through 2 iterations of this and entering a third, not us, but it's all internal now. And Colin was very astute, and he said, in this diocese, there are people who are saying to us, give us the outcomes, which means they're asking programmatic questions. We've learned, unless this kind of process becomes deeply a part of our DNA, we don't stand a chance. And that's what we are framing and introducing on the journey. So I'm going to ask Fiona now just to walk you through the 5 steps, and then it'll give you a chance then to interact with us with questions.
want to turn to page 3 in the handout that we gave you today. So you'll notice on page 3 that we have 2 columns here. One is the clergy column and the other is the congregations. And basically what this document is a summary of the steps that we go through in this 5-step process. So tomorrow when we meet with the congregations, we'll be going through in more detail the congregation column there that explains all the steps in the process for congregations. We can talk about that a little bit today and answer any questions that you might have about that, but at the moment I want to focus on the clergy side because this is what impacts you. So as Alan said, part of what your role is in this process is looking at your own leadership capacities, skills, expertise, growing edges that you can develop to walk alongside what your congregations are doing to provide them with a new kind of leadership to help them as they move through this process, okay? So the first step is a listening and attending step. So as part of that, you spend some time dwelling in the Word, just like we did this morning, similar kind of exercise, where you continually spend time dwelling in Scripture, listening to what the other is hearing coming out of the text, listening to how God is speaking to you as clergy in this time and this place. The other part of the listening aspect for clergy is what we call the Leader 360. Now this is a survey tool that we've developed, and what it does is it provides you with feedback around your own leadership skills and capacities. So this is a tool that's done electronically. You get your own unique survey that you send out to peers, your congregation members, your boards, your staff, and they all provide feedback. They work their way through this survey, which explores 16 different types of leadership skills and capacities. So you work through that, and you also are doing listening in your own neighborhoods. So we provide you with exercises to do where you go out in your own neighborhoods to learn how to pay attention to what God is doing out there already. And then you're also listening to your congregation process. And as you're listening to what they're doing, you begin to discern the kinds of skills and capacities that you need to develop in yourselves to help them as they move through this process. So that's step 1, listening and attending. Then we move into discerning. And again, we've got dwelling in the Word. You'll see dwelling in the Word is an integral part of this whole process, start to finish, all the way through. We're continually spending time dwelling in the Word, continuing to practice listening to what God is saying to us through this text and through listening to the other through the text. Coming out of the listening step, in the discerning step, you get a whole complete report on your survey that you've completed that gives you a big picture of all the areas for what we would call missional transformational leadership, where you can focus your attention on some of the areas that are specific to areas that you feel that you could spend some time on. We look at your leadership history. There's listening work surrounding the 360 report, continuing to discern what you're seeing in your neighborhood. So you've gone out and you've watched and listened, and then we take you through some exercises in, okay, so what am I learning from my experience of listening in my neighborhood? And then coming out of all this listening, what's happening in your congregation process, what's happening as far as what you're learning about your own leadership skills and capacities, what's happening in your neighborhoods, we start to work on discerning, okay, so what might be some things that would be good for me to try? Just some new experience of things to try that are going to help me get at some of my primary leadership challenges. Now these are not big, huge things. These are just small experiments that are discerned out of the listening process. Then we move into the actual experimenting stage, where you take some of those experiments that you've identified and you go try them. And the experiment stage is important because of what it teaches you. It's not so much about the result of your experiments, but what are you learning from having had the experience of doing the experiments. The experiments are carried out over 6 months, and there's a regular process of sharing with the clergy team, actually right from the beginning all the way through the 5 steps. So you're continually sharing with your clergy team what you're learning, and you also are looking at how this is continuing to connect with the work that your congregations are doing. So you're not in your congregation team doing the work with them, but you're constantly paying attention to what they are doing and using that information to reflect on your own leadership skills and capacities. After the experimenting step is finished, we move into step 4, which is evaluating. Now, evaluating is, what have we learned here? What have we learned from the experiments that have happened? You have some opportunity for feedback, to ask questions, explore lessons learned. And again, remember, this is done with a team. So you're not doing this as a solo person, you're doing this with your peers, sharing your experiences with one another and helping each other pull out from your experiences what you're learning. And again, connecting with the work of the congregation learning community. So they're sort of following the same steps roughly at the same time as you are. So when you're working on your evaluating, they're working on their evaluating. What have they learned from their experiments that they've tried? And then after we do the evaluating, it's, okay, so what are next steps now? This is the point that Al was just mentioning, that you get to that 18-month part and it's time to evaluate. Okay, so what do we do next? We want to keep doing some more experiments. What are we learning from those? And then so you're invited into this rhythm of this continual action, reflection, learning. Okay, so that sort of summarizes the clergy one. Just looking at time.
Yeah, go. Walk through.
Okay. Let's spend a bit of time and go through the congregation one, just so you have an idea of what your congregations are doing at the same time as you're doing your own exploration here. So step 1, again, listening and attending. This is where we start. We start where everybody is and understanding where people are right now and learning how to listen. So your congregational team will engage in dwelling in the Word. Again, throughout the whole process, dwelling in the Word is integral through the whole process. So they'll be doing dwelling in the Word. They're going to be listening to stories of God's actions in the congregation through one another. So one of the things that the congregations do right out of the gate is talk to each other and learn how to listen to each other again. So your team will have a list of questions. They'll go out and they'll interview people just to listen to them. Listen to where they've seen God at work in your church. Listen to times when they've felt most alive in their faith. What's been going on for them at those times? Listen to what's important to them in the life of your churches. So they listen to each other. And they're also going to be listening in their communities as well. So we give them a list of exercises to walk through their neighborhoods. Very simple exercises, just a worksheet to work through. So they're walking around in their neighborhoods. What are they seeing? What are they hearing? What do their neighborhoods look like? And this is part of the practice, part of the new practices of learning how to pay attention to what's going on. Then the congregations will move into step 2 and they do their own discerning work. So they've gone out and they've interviewed people in your church, they've interviewed each other, they've listened to each other, and they've put together this profile of what does your church look like? Where are your people right now? And then start to consider that in the context of what have they heard in the neighborhood? What's going on around your churches, in the communities where your churches are, in their own neighborhoods where they find themselves? What's going on? And what kinds of experiments might the Spirit be inviting us as a congregation to go and try? And then experiment teams are formed. Now again, the purpose of the experiments is not the outcome of the experiments, it's what is the congregation learning about itself? How is the congregation being transformed by the experience of these experiments? And they're very simple, not high budget, not high outcome, not high stakes kind of experiments, but just new things to try. They can fail because you learn lots of things when things fail. So then they have their experimenting period where they spend time just doing the experiments that they have discerned will be important things for them to try. And then they'll prepare a report on what they've learned from their experience. Then they go into the evaluating stage and they're reporting back to the broader congregation. What have they learned? Reporting back to council. What have we learned? And they start to begin to explore a new way of living into a new future of being church. So this experiment and reflection cycle begins. And so they try it, they go, what have we learned? What worked well for us? What didn't work well for us? What do we want to try again? What do we want to try slightly differently? And again, these are not high stakes things. It's okay to fail because the lessons are in the learning. And so it's a constant cycle of this. They're trying something, what have we learned? Okay, let's try something new, what have we learned? So this is the cycle that we're inviting them into. So any questions about either of those? That's a very high level kind of overview of what this looks like. Yes?
How large are the congregation learning communities?
Like the guiding teams? Basically what we do is a guiding team is formed in each congregation, where it's a group of people that sort of decide, okay, we're going to take this on and we're going to work our way through this process. Typically, you probably wouldn't want to be less than 5, but you don't want it to be too big either. Somewhere between 5 and 9 people maybe.
I guess my part question is, what is a congregation learning community?
Oh, sorry. The congregation learning communities are the collections of the guiding teams.
Okay.
So in each congregation, you'll have a guiding team with X number of members based on the size of your church, based on what makes sense in your own context. And on a regular basis throughout each of the 5 steps, we bring those guiding teams in each of the congregations together. So they're learning and sharing with each other about what their experience has been like. Yeah.
How do you bring everybody together? Do they have to be physically together, or can we do it electronically? Because coming together in a place as huge as where we are is almost hard. It's really hard, especially given the fact we're starting in winter.
Yeah, that's true. That's something that Julianne and I have been talking about, and we're going to try to, getting people together physically is best, obviously, because they get to spend time together, experience together, and it's better than obviously being done remotely. But there are limitations, and so we try our best to work out the best learning experience for everybody, given the constrictions that exist.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Those of us who are serving in multi-denominational settings, can the guiding team be a group of, like, we have kind of 2 denominations working together?
Yeah.
Okay.
One question I've got, I'm in a 2-point parish. One is like really, really tiny. Last Sunday we had 9 people out, including me, the pianist, and her husband, who came from another town. Can they be a part, like, can those 2 congregations work together? Or is it better to have, like, I know for sure the one congregation, the bigger one, is, where do we sign up, was the response. Like, we want to be a part of this. If the other ones want to be as well, how can that work? Is that a possibility?
Is there a way that somebody in the smaller group could participate with the larger group?
Yeah,
At least get the benefit of the learning and the experience?
That's what I'm wondering, if that's a possibility, if
Yeah.
that can work that way.
Yeah, we could do that. Yes?
Well, I have a couple of questions that are kind of related
Okay.
to each other. First, it seems like there are experiments for the clergy and experiments for the congregational team that are not the same experiments.
That's right.
That's what I'm hearing.
Yes, that's right.
So then my question is, I'm serving in a co-pastorate situation. Are we on the same team, and are our experiments clergy team experiments?
Are you both participating?
Well, would we have to be? I mean,
You would do your own experiments, because your experiments that you're doing are reflective of, they're coming out of the growing edges that you're exploring in your own leadership and your own capacities for leading in this way. So you wouldn't do the experiments jointly, because you may have different leadership capacities that you identify as the area that you need to focus on for your own leadership development.
but we would be in the same leader team.
Cool.
That's okay.
No
Yeah,
problem.
yeah. Yes.
I'm interested in how big the congregational communities would end up being. Where I'm going with that is how many congregations do you anticipate engaging in the first round?
Probably not less than 5. 5, 7, 8, depending on what is going to make sense with all kinds of things. It's something that Julianne and I would need to work through. we've got geography there, we've got all kinds of different factors going on. Not less than 5 probably, but we wouldn't want to have a whole massive group starting out the gate either. Yes?
I think what we talked about, we were wondering how we would group congregations together. But the current plan is for when they come together as a big group, they would be coming here. And so that could be 3 groups of 5, or 3 groups of 7, or pretty much 3 groups of 7, that's probably. So the thing that I have in my head about how many altogether in the synod is just about 20-ish.
Right. But I think, was your question about a specific group though? How big is
More
it?
was about the dynamic of, as you bring the groups together, at what point does that group coming together now become so large that the conversations and the experiences are more effective?
Right.
That's not what we're doing.
No, we
That
wouldn't.
was where the question
Okay,
came.
yeah, no.
You should say something about, when we bring them together, we're actually giving them a chance to tell stories
Oh,
and train them.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah. So when they come together at each of the steps, they are reflecting with each other on what they've been doing in the previous step. So we basically, step 1, this is what you're going to do in step 1. You're going to listen in your neighborhoods, you're going to listen to the people in the congregation, you're going to listen to God through dwelling in the Word. So they go out and they do that. And then they come back together, and when they come back together at the beginning of step 2, part of what they do is spend time telling each other about what their experience has been. And we're giving them the tools to go out and do step 2. So that's the sort of the rhythm that happens at each step.
And then coaching in between.
And there is coaching that happens in between the steps too. So we're keeping in touch with the congregation teams and making sure that they've not got any questions. How are they doing? How can we help them? How can we support them as they're working their way through each of the steps?
Could you just clarify when you say we, who that is, please?
We are sure, yeah.
Because they're worried it's me.
No.
Just say it.
The first iteration going through this, I mean, the long-term plan with this whole process is that this becomes a part of how your synod functions. So the long-term plan is that there are people that are experienced in this who want to share what they've learned, and the cycle continues and diffuses throughout the synod. First go around though, we are very involved, the missional network. And so, like, I work right now with 6 different congregations in BC who are just getting into the beginning of the experimenting stage of this. And so I've walked alongside each of those 6 congregations from the beginning, worked with them as they've listened to their congregations' stories, helped them figure out how to put together their listening report about what they've learned about what's happening in their congregations, talk to them about their experiment ideas, and help them to figure out, okay, so what is the best kind of experiment that we could try? How can we most successfully give this a go to see what we can learn? So that's what I do. I walk along beside the congregation teams in the first iteration of this. And then you have people who have experienced it and who are excited about it and who want to learn more about it, and that's how the whole process gets diffused through the synod. But the first go around, the missional network is the ones who are walking beside that first group of congregations. Yes?
And could you also explain the parallel relationship that happens for the clergy clusters with regard to the 360s in Allen, and what that conversation looks like, and how those are unfolded in terms of clusters?
Why don't you do that?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
As clergy, and again, I don't know how many there are going to be, and I will be working with Julie, Anna. So as clergy, you would be formed into clusters, and again, maybe 5 or 6 people in a cluster, and you're going to meet either face-to-face or online, and we do both, once a month in a carefully designed process in which you are learning to resource one another. And those clusters will be coached. And so that you meet, and you meet either online or face-to-face with a coach, who moves you through this process. Furthermore, when, for example, you do your 360, and just to say a little bit about that, this is nothing like any 360 you've ever done in terms of it's not an evaluation tool that anybody sees except you. It really is a way. Remember I said that nobody changes unless they live in this virtuous space of security and anxiety. Remember that? What this 360 does, it gives you the gift of security and anxiety. You're going to look at, and because we've created 16 categories across which 25 or 30 people that you choose are going to respond to the 360, and they're responding to how they see you leading in these 16 categories. But these 16 categories are not the classic teach, preach, hatch, match, dispatch stuff. The 16 categories are what are the characteristics, the leadership characteristics of leaders who effectively lead their systems through adaptive change. That's what we're looking at. And when you get your report back, you go, whoa, I am really being affirmed here in and you also go, depending upon your denominational background, either whoa or holy this is not quite lining up with what I thought about myself. Security and anxiety. And then what you do is you get that report, and then first time around, you get on the phone with someone like me. Probably it will be me. And I will give you a one-on-one walk through your report and help you to see some of the things you need to take note of. So that's one of the key engagements. In this cluster group, you take this report, as Fiona's described it, and you're going to do several things with it. You're going to look at those 16 characteristics, and you're going to say, of those 16, what 3 are skills, capacities that if I began to attend to these things over the next 12 months, could begin to make a significant inroad into my leadership in this process of change. The second thing you're going to do is you are going through a series of interviews, through working with the feedback, through working in your cluster group. You're going to answer the question, what one adaptive leadership challenge do I need to address for myself in this congregation if I am going to effectively lead this congregation over the next 12 months in change? So, 2 or 3 skills and characteristics, a key adaptive challenge. You know what I mean by a key adaptive challenge? Remember, how many of you are familiar with Heifetz's work of technical and adaptive? Okay, how many of you are not familiar with that language? Okay, some of you. Way oversimplification. A technical challenge is you're all going to get back in your cars, you're going to drive somewhere, and as you're driving, you're going to go, I got a sermon I got to give on Sunday. It's a challenge. You got to do it. But what makes it technical is you've been trained to do it, you know how to do it, you got all the resources to do it. An adaptive challenge is I got to address something, and I have no clue how to do it. So, for example, listening to some of you, I'm in the midst of leading a congregation where the numbers are going down and it's not growing, and left the way it is, it's going to end. And I want to change this, but I have no idea how to do it. So an adaptive challenge answers the question, what are the challenges that I am facing currently that I must address if this congregation is to thrive, but I don't know how to do it? That's an adaptive challenge. And so what we do is we help you identify those 3 skills capacities and learn how to begin to name that adaptive challenge. And again, I'm just doing this right now with the clergy and the Lutheran clergy in BC. I meet with each of them online, often 2 or 3 times actually, and help them refine and really get at what's adaptive. To really deep down dig at what's adaptive and design an adaptive challenge. And those 2 things then become the experiment that you work on. So your experiment is, how do I put this adaptive challenge into play in the congregation over the next 12 months? And we help you design that. So that when you come together, either face-to-face or online, with the other members of your team, you're now sharing with them what you've tried, what you're doing, what's not working, and the team continues to become a co-learning community to help each other problem solve and figure out. So we keep building this sense of being for one another, out by 2s, not alone. So that's the work. And first time around, we in TMN provide the coaching and that kind of engagement with you. But the other part of our work is we're asking, and working with Julianne in this, who inside the system are going to become the coaches for the next rounds? Does this get what you're asking?
Yes, sir.
Any questions about, yes?
Oh, so you're not with that.
There's what?
It's about something else. So,
Okay, go ahead and then Fiona.
it's more of a personal question. What if we are going to be gone? It's like,
If you're going to be gone what?
well, like I'm going on a sabbatical, so for 6 months. So is it still possible to be a part of the process, or?
When are we starting?
February 14th, 15th.
And when do you get back from your sabbatical?
From August to January next year.
Oh, I don't know. We can talk about it and work it out. I don't know.
We have just a few little connecting dots from, okay, so I'm here today, and tomorrow some of my congregation members will hopefully be here, the weather is no worse than it is today. Then what? How does that all come together into February 15th? And
So, the process, as I understand it, they're going to tell me if I have it correctly. I should go forward, okay.
You stand right here.
Stand on the X.
Right there. And don't move.
Hey, that's hard for me because I talk like this. So the process is one of conversation, covenanting, and application combined. So we have forms ready for you that say, as a pastor, I would like to participate in this. We have congregational commitments that require reading through and signing, like with details, emails, names, and so on, that will be like an application. Because, as someone said, how do we have to figure out how the groups go together, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, who wants in and who doesn't. We don't know any of these things until we have this sort of system. So there's an application / covenanting form available for both clergy and for congregations. Now, part of this gift of opportunity is for pastors whose congregations or don't have a congregation, or don't have a congregation who are, it's the right time for them, are still allowed to participate. Correct? However, a congregation cannot participate without their pastor. Yes. Okay? I'm just checking. So, pastor, if this seems to resonate with you as a process that would help you in your own growth as a leader and give you some skills, then you know, just apply, kind of thing. But congregations will have to decide whether or not they're committed. And so I guess the bottom line is, if this doesn't seem right to the pastor, a congregation's not going to be able to come in, because both have to go in for congregations and pastors. Does that answer that part? Now the other thing, yes?
yeah, so today I'm going to go home with something that I'm going to, like, that's sort of
Think
an
about?
application. Tomorrow my people are going to come home with something.
Yes, and then you're going to talk about it and get it into the office, either by mail or scanned, it says on the bottom, to me by December 15th. That's a month. And by January,
Okay,
3 weeks.
3 weeks. It's 3 weeks. And then by January 15th, we're going to let you know. That was probably a month when I was making up the forms. And then by January 15th, we'll have an idea, and then, because then you need time to plan for February 14th, which is here. Now, there's one thing that I don't think is really clear from our conversation today. The congregational groups have dates already set. You know, I can say February 15th, May, whatever, like we've kind of got tentative dates. That's for the congregations to gather. Clergy are not gathering all together like this again until the end, correct? We're going to gather together cluster-wise,
Correct.
but not necessarily here. So the clusters are going to be far afield. The congregational groupings are all coming together here to do the community learning as their guiding teams together. So the cluster dates for your group of pastors has not been determined because, you know, we kind of have to figure that out as who's in and where they live and how it's going to work. That's why we need a bit of time to work it through. You're looking so confused. Okay, go ahead.
Me, Wayne?
Yeah.
I know Greg wants to know, are the forms available online?
They are online under the missional formation tab on the website. I checked this morning. Ha-ha.
And if I can have just one more question, which is not necessary for you, Julianne.
Okay.
You're saying a minimum of 5 people up to 9 in a congregation where my active membership is probably 25 people, and half of those are on council, but what if you can't get like 5 people? Like, do you know what I mean? It could.
3?
Like, I don't know that I could get 5 people necessarily that could really fully, because of health issues, age issues, travel issues, all kinds of things and people being already sort of taxed.
Yeah.
Because there's of an active membership of 25 people, there aren't 25 people who can actively participate in a lot of things that go on in the congregational, right? Because some of them just are not able.
Yeah.
So, does it limit small congregations then to really be a part of this program?
Well, if your congregation is only 25 people total, you could probably do a guiding team of 3.
I mean, I may have 5 people coming here tomorrow, but that doesn't mean 5 people are going to jump on.
No. But proportionately, 3 out of 25 is a lot different than 5 out of 150. Yeah. So you've got buy-in is kind of what you're
Yeah,
looking
buy-in.
for. Right, you're talking about how many people are willing to participate.
There's got to be a clear sense that the energy is not primarily being driven by you.
Right.
And you're the one that would need to make the assessment around, would 2 or 3 people do that in terms of this?
Mark?
So the willingness to participate on a congregation's part probably also depends on financial commitment. And from my perspective, that means going to council.
Right.
To have those conversations. And
Right.
our next council meeting won't happen until after your deadline. So I'm just
Send it in pending financial approval. Because that'll give
I
us,
don't know that have buy-in though, because they need to have a conversation at council, is what I'm getting at.
okay.
I got the same problem, one day after your deadline.
I'll stretch the deadline.
Okay, so when's our deadline then? January 1st. I was trying to get it done before Christmas, honestly.
I appreciate that, just when you said the 15th, my council meeting's the 16th. So.
Yeah, so I mean, it was just trying to get it off your plate before Christmas. But if that's not possible, are we good with January 1st? Is the consensus? Am I seeing nods?
Well, that's a holiday.
It doesn't matter. Apparently it doesn't matter in the church.
Email works.
Okay, Christian, you had a question? Arm up?
I was pointing to Mark. It's the same question. My council meets after the proposed deadline, so if we can do that in January, that would be...
January 1st will work?
Yeah.
Okay. Am I getting a nod from Bishop? Yes? No?
Sure.
Sure, there we go. Chris?
How often do clergy clusters meet?
Every month, at least.
Yes, once
Every
a
month.
month.
Is this separate from our other clergy clusters, or?
Yes.
in addition to them? So yes, it's separate, it's additional,
In addition to.
Okay.
Unless you get your whole cluster to buy in and then you change your church clergy cluster meeting.
I mean, quite frankly, in Calgary, it may become the active clergy cluster just because those are the people who like to come and gather and, you know. But it is, no, it's got a different purpose. Yes, Tim?
I have a question, probably more for the...
Okay, can I go now? Sure. Thank you.
Let's take a
Get
look.
on.
Okay.
I'd say I'd be in a recruitment process, trying to pitch this to some folks. And what kind of people do you want leading this? You know, obviously there'll be the early adopter that's ready to jump in, but nobody trusts them because they've already screwed up 10 things already. Right? And then you got the stubborn lady who'll do it if you ask her, but it'll be miserable for everybody else. And then we got the Bible with all these other crazy characters who succeed wildly. So, who is it that you would say this is the kind of person that would be a great member of this team of 3 or 5 people?
The keeners.
Well, first of all, somebody who is not up to their eyes in church responsibilities already. That's one key.
Stay away from council.
Yeah, stay away from council. I mean, it's okay if you have maybe one member of council or something on your team, if that makes sense. But generally what we say is you want a team of people who are not the ones who always are putting their hands up saying, yes, I'll do that, yes, I'll do that, yes, I'll do that, who have all kinds of other key leadership responsibilities in your church already, and they need to spend their attention doing that. This is a separate piece and requires its own attention, so you don't want to sort of do it off the side of your desk, right? So it's people who are not in the current key leadership capacities from a lay perspective in your church. People who are curious. People who are not ones who are going to sit there and look for roadblocks, because that will just get in your way. People who have the trust of other people in your congregation. You don't want to pick the one who's done a million things and it has continued to fail and nobody's going to trust them. That would not be a good person to have on your team. People who, curiosity is a really big part of this. The defaults are always going to be there, and part of what the work that we do is try to help people see that. But if you have people who are curious about what's possible and what might happen here, those are good people to have involved
So
in this.
people who are not helpful are actually some of the early adopters. Because they tend to be people who, they already assume they know all about how to do this. And I mean, I'm talking about real people that you want people who, with curiosity, but people who are going to be willing to walk with a process. And a lot of times early adopters look at a process and they know 6 shortcuts and 5 different ways of doing it. And we have a mantra, which is don't mess with our process. Or else.
You mess with success.
Sure, thank you, and I suspect some people will have folks coming here tomorrow who they do not want on their team. And they might be trying to figure out how to proceed with battle axe in hand or pressuring them out.
I'm sure we can preempt that, Fiona.
Yeah.
Yeah. You need someone who's a good organizer.
Yeah.
It's always good to have somebody on these teams who's really good at just organizing stuff. Details. Yep.
And this is a detail for tomorrow. For those of us who are going to be on the webinar for tomorrow, should we be there with our group, our congregational group
Tomorrow?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Oh.
Yeah, that's fine.
I told people they shouldn't come with their congregations.
I'm afraid that if there's like a technical failure, they're all going to just go home.
Oh,
Yeah.
no. Yeah, no, I'd be there with them, that's fine.
That's okay.
Just don't, don't become the answer person to
Right.
everything.
Yeah, because like what we've been saying all along, the really important thing about the congregation teams is they know is that they are leading this themselves. And if the default of them is to go directly to you always, because that's what they do, then that's where you've got to really, really be careful. Yeah.
Actually, I need to say something about the money. I think it would be helpful
Sure.
to straighten that out. Just so everybody's clear, Bishop Larry kindly asked the ELCIC CEP plan if this $300 could be used from that fund, and the answer is yes. So for those of you who are wondering where you're going to come up with the $300 for the the rostered 360, that's one place you could do. If you can get your congregation to pay for it, that's also a good place, but nonetheless.
The other part is the congregational piece. The letter was a long time ago. It's clearly on this form, but it's related to worship attendance, weekly worship attendance. So it's supposed to allow for smaller congregations to participate without so much duress as a larger congregation who can afford more. Okay, so that's those two. And when it comes to the details of sending money in, whenever you send in your remittance, your benevolence remittance, your monthly remittance, I should be clear about that, just send it in monthly. Because we have to pay the missional network, right? So monthly is the idea, and benevolence at the same time is good, or? Yes, I'm getting a nod from the back. So that was the money thing. Is there any questions about that kind of detail-y thing? So if you want to email, the application form is on the web. You should be able to print it, download it, and just email it to me. Julianne@albertasynod.ca. Don't try to use the ELC address. We're having computer troubles. And or mail it if you need to, or scan it, whichever you need, But if you mail it, it needs to go to the Synod office. Okay, that was it. No money questions? No application questions? Oh, yes. So sorry. James?
Greg has a question again.
Yes?
About when will the video of tomorrow's presentation be available? Because I think he'd like to show in the congregation before they make it.
As soon as Julianne can figure out how to get it off the camera and to someone who can put it on the web. Sorry.
It's okay, I'm just waiting for him to type and see if we heard that.
Okay?
We
As soon as-
an email once it's happened.
Tell him I will send a Google thing saying it's on the web. The idea would be that it would be available as soon as I can find someone to put on the web.
To our congregation on Sunday, we don't expect that.
It's a long
So
thing,
much
it's
fun,
2
right?
hours,
That's right.
it's 4 hours.
That's the whole season of Advent, every sermon.
Now you know why we want January 1.
Okay.
Does anybody else have any other questions about anything?
Trish just said, just take some time and look through your congregation who might be interested, which is what we've already done at Santa. And there's a few people we talked to said, we might ask you to give up some of your other things that you can focus your time on this. So.
Yeah. Any other questions?
It's a one-pager?
Yep. These are the clergy ones, the rostered applications. So they're down on the front here if you want to pick up a paper copy.
I wonder, running through, I don't want to think about, running through a lot of your responses this morning was this broader question of whether you called it renewal, transformational, missional, but this underlying question of how do you change the culture of a congregation? That's the language I would use. But I think that was a generic question for many of you. Has what we've done this morning and this afternoon helped you to understand how we go about doing that? Has it begun to address that question for you, or are there other questions that you need to hear from in order to get a clear sense of that? Yes, sir.
The guiding team, do they have any formal power within the congregation?
They can fire the pastor at any time they want. No, they don't. They don't. And usually, what we want them to do is also regularly report to council or leaders of the church about what they're doing, what they're up to, how things are progressing. But they do not have formal power at all, in terms of, as I understand that.
Can you give an example of what an experiment that's been done, what it looked like?
I can give you an example of tons and tons of experiments. This always becomes kind of anxiety moments for people. I'm thinking of one Lutheran church that actually thought it had failed, but
This is a Lutheran church which is doing a lot of good things in its community. Food pantries and people, just loads of good things. And so one experiment that they did, and this gets into defaults, was to ask, in all those good things that they're doing for people and in meeting needs, how could they actually begin to move from serving someone in a food pantry to actually being invited to sit at their table and have lunch or supper with them and just listen and build a relationship. That's a simple experiment. I'll give you another experiment. This is how simple they are, and I'll explain why they need to be this simple. Fiona and I were talking about this on the way over. My wife just kind of lives this all the time. She just got to know a Chinese couple in the community, and how did she do it? I can't remember how she did it, but they're new from China. This is Vancouver, right? Hong Kong in Canada, and they said to her, "We don't understand your Christmas." And she said, "Well, what is it? What would you like to know?" "Well, Christmas trees." So she said, "Okay, let's go next week." This was 2 days. This was last week. "Let's go to Canadian Tire and buy a Christmas tree." So she went with them, bought a Christmas tree, and then they said, "Well, how do you decorate a Christmas tree?" Right? And so yesterday, she spent the whole day at their house decorating the Christmas tree. Well, you can't not decorate a Christmas tree without talking about why that sucker is there, right? And so the conversation's there, but the relationship is building, and a family that would never walk into the door of our churches, you're building a relationship and a connection. And that family, I'm told, is going to be over to our house before Christmas, and we're going to be sharing a meal together, and they're already sending over, and I can tell you, they were very good. They make, these dumplings that they make with all kind of good stuff in them? Well, anyway, simple experiment. Now, my wife Jane does this all kinds of natural ways, and people just start talking about God, and it raises all kinds of questions about what is that. So those are some very simple experiments. I know some folk who are, I would never do this, but they dog walk through their community. And when they dog walk through their community, they get to know people because, poop and scoop and what a beautiful dog and all of that. Simple experiment. It goes on and on and on. A friend of mine just joined the pickup hockey team of guys as part of, but you see, these experiments are now seen as part of a larger conversation of listening and discernment and this conviction that God is up to something in the midst of those relationships. And I know you're not asking this, but here's the piece. When numbers of people start to do these kinds of experiments, it fundamentally changes the kind of questions you're asking inside the church. And you see, here's the thing. Until the questions change, you can't get at these issues of discipleship and growth and other sorts of things. So is that helpful in terms of experiments? Yeah. Anything else? Particularly about this culture change stuff.
Susan has a practical question.
Any question, yeah, go for it.
She wants to know, for the pastors 360, what if there aren't enough adult worshipers, or how many do you need for the questionnaire?
In the 360, we usually ask for around 20-25 respondents, but those respondents are a blending of, obviously you fill it out on yourself, people in the church congregation, peers, others that know you in other leadership things. So it's a blending of people. And if, if you're in a small church, then we'll talk to you and say, okay, what have you got? What's realistic? Where are some others? But it's best if you get 20 or 25 responses. And this is just to say, I don't need to go down the road on this too far, but, well, it doesn't matter. So, yeah, that answers the question. There was another question. Somebody had a hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to revisit a comment you made this morning. Just before you were sharing about shalom versus tact.
Yes.
You said, well, I wouldn't get into this with the congregation.
Right.
Yet this is our context.
Yes.
Can I just have you say why you would
Yes.
consider?
Yes. As clergy, you have all kinds of opportunities to do biblical engagement with people. Sunday morning when you stand above criticism and give it to them. There may be Bible study groups, which are very appropriate. This is dwelling in the Word, okay? And the critical thing about dwelling is constantly giving to the people themselves the sense, the experience, the conviction, the belief that they can hear the Spirit of God. And if I were meeting with a congregational group and I were bringing in my interpretation of Parks and that into that, I'd shut down that piece. Now, having said that, as you begin to get dwelling going, it's perfectly fine in a Bible study group where you are, the rules of the game are, this is Bible study and all of that, to introduce some of these ideas, but the pedagogy is critical when you're doing that. So it's just about where you do this. And what I was saying really is, don't become the professional master of divinity, controller of the Bible in the dwelling process. I did it in this room with you as clergy because I was trying to push into and illustrate the kind of disruptive culture stuff that lies underneath it. Am I answering your question? Yeah. Yeah. There's one other piece, and we'll stop, is that and again, these are, well, let me just do it now, stop there. There's lots of theories of culture change. How does culture change? How does it take place? You've got people like James Davidson Hunter, who wrote a book about 1.5 years ago, and the argument he makes is that elites change culture. I make the argument in the opposite direction. Elites never change culture. That the best thing the thing that elites do is that the reason that they're elites, and you are elites, by the way, is that they have developed the skills to pay attention to what's going on under the surface. And they have the skills to help people name that. But culture change always takes place when ordinary men and women in the midst of everyday life start to recognize that the habits and practices that have brought them success are no longer bringing success, and that they don't know what other responses to make. In that space, all kinds of things start happening off screen, if you will, under the surface, in ordinary people in their everyday life. And if you learn to attend to what's going on off the screen, under the surface, in everyday life, you'll discover the clues to people learning new habits and practices. That's why I talk about leaders becoming midwives, birthing the ordinary and the everyday. That's why I talk about leaders as being tillers of the soil for that to take place. It is very different than bearers of visions and developers of strategic plans. It's very different. The other thing, and this comes from the work of Everett Rogers and a whole lot of other people, is that cultures change when about 15% of the people in a group start living into new habits and practices and attitudes and values. And when you get about 15% of a group of people living into new habits, attitudes, practices, and values, the culture will shift and it won't go back. Yeah,
You're saying 1-5, not 5-0.
I'm saying 1-5. Yeah, right? So, real culture change is what are the skills and capacities that I need as a pastor, as a rostered leader, to cultivate the kind of environment that invites about 15% of my people into a new set of habits, practices, attitudes, and values. And what do those practices and habits and attitudes and values need to be? And I began the day by suggesting what they were. One of those habits and practices is a change of focus. It's no longer how do you make the church work, but how do we discern what God's up to out ahead of us? And it's a change in attitude. It's much less how do we help people, and it's much more how do we sit and dwell, this is Luke 10, at the table of the other and listen in the midst of their lives. And the 5-step process is all designed to help you go on that journey in that direction. So, I think, yeah.
I just thought of one more thing. I just wanted to say, for those of you that are thinking this is not the right time, the plan is to do this again, starting the fall of, well, after 18 months, the fall of 2015, and again. So it's not, I wanted just to make you aware that it does, if it's not the right time at this moment, if it's not the right thing at this moment, there's another whole startup again in 2015 in the fall.
And it's never the right time.
That's true too. If you're, see, when you said, someone asked who might be, go on up there. I was thinking, I said to people, whoever the Holy Spirit's been poking, those are the people to invite. The ones that have said something's, going on. But anyway, so if something's poking you, it's not supposed to feel comfortable, right?
Right.
Right.
Thank you for being here, for participating in this day. This has been in the works, sorry I'm not on the X, in the works for quite some time, and I wanted to give you just a little bit of background. We asked Alan to come to our spring Synod Council meeting, so he was here for a full morning with our Synod Council and sat through some of our meeting as well, here at Red Deer. Then we gathered a small group of people, including Synod staff and others from Synod Council and a few others at Providence Retreat Center in Edmonton to explore what Alan was sharing further with us at that time, and then moving in terms of preparing for this day and the days to come. Synod Council has given support for this and working with the Mission Network for these 18 months, and we're thankful for that. Support, particularly financial support for flights and accommodations and all those kinds of things. We've also asked Alan to present at our Synod Convention next year, so he'll be with us in June as well. Alan will be doing, is it 3 presentations? 3 presentations at Synod Convention, and then Michael Harvey with Back to Church Sunday, et cetera, will be doing the 4th session at our Synod Convention. So there won't be workshops at the convention, there will be presentations and small group conversation as well. Wanted to say thank you to James for your work on relaying questions from people. Certainly to Alan and Fiona for your time with us, and we look forward to tomorrow. Julianne, Sharon, thank you very much. Mark and your congregation for hosting us as well. I want to conclude with a hymn in just a minute, but you might want to find it. It's 849 in ELW. The Cranberry, 849. This is a hymn that one of the blessings of being a bishop is you travel around a lot and experience a lot of variety in worship. And this was a hymn that I hadn't heard before from this hymn book, and I just have fallen in love with it, partly because of the Spanish as well. So hold on to that hymn, and then what I'd like to invite you to do as we close today is join with that person that you were with for the first part this morning, when you first arrived, and would you pray for each other? Now, some people may not have that dyad, someone may have left, but just join so there's a small group of 3. So whoever you were with to talk about your setting, your context as you arrived this morning. And would you just take 5 minutes and pray for each other? And if you're not a 2, find a 3. Yeah, let's just give us, make sure everybody got it.
Thank you. I'm not doing this stuff. Oh, is that right? Yeah, I was talking about yeah, let's do that. I was trying to get Greg as well. Yeah, because
This still
yeah, please. Sunday afternoon. So John. Yeah. Gifted us both with incredible immense opportunities. Spread out as diverse aware of the terrors and the soul, spirit, travel, just pray that everyone close hands see all of that. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, how did that go?
Let's conclude with hymn 849. Let's stand. And if you're not familiar with it, join in as you become familiar.
What number is it?
849. And we'll just sing in English. And then we'll be on our way. Unless you like to do the Spanish. Yours, Lord, is the glory and honor as well. Yours, Lord, now and always. Amen. Amen. We'll just pick up the tempo a bit. Yours, Lord, the dominion and power as well. Yours, Lord, now and always. Amen. Amen. To you I surrender my being, my life. All, Lord, I surrender. Amen. Amen. Glory in the highest and on earth as well. Glory, hallelujah, amen, amen. And go with these words from Paul in Romans. The God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that you may abound in hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Blessings as you journey and as you discern the days ahead for you and congregation as well.